a detective in a murder case in rural Louisiana, where strange rules hold the key. In the deep, mysterious swamps of rural Louisiana, a murder has shaken the very foundations of this quiet town. But there's a catch. Strange rules govern everything here, and every clue comes with an unexpected twist. Join Detective Quentin as he unravels these eerie guidelines and uncovers dark secrets that even the locals are afraid to talk about. Curious? Intrigued? You won't want to miss a moment. Subscribe to Mr. Quentin's channel and follow the investigation in real time, because in Louisiana, nothing is ever as it seems. Lily Moore, 17 years old, the daughter of a single mother, went missing for 2 days before she was found at the edge of the Belle Rive swamp in Louisiana. Her body was stripped to the bone in some places, while other parts remained intact. Her hands were neatly placed on her chest, as if carefully arranged. This was not just a murder. It was a message. I arrived in Belle Rive on a bleak October morning, driving down empty 2-lane roads flanked by towering, bald cypress trees, their skeletal forms standing like sentinels over the flooded land. The town sat on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, where the ground felt more like a forgotten part of the swamp than a piece of civilization. Abandoned sugar mills loomed in rusted silence beneath the gray sky, while mobile homes, sinking deeper with each passing flood season, bore statues of the Virgin Mary in their yards. Belle Rive was small, a single gas station, a church, and a handful of scattered shops along its main street, all swallowed by the surrounding fields and thick swampland. A place where people didn't like to talk to outsiders, where the law was more of a vague idea than an enforced reality. Sheriff Earl Duval was waiting for me at the only diner in Belle Rive. He was in his 60s, a man worn down by too many years of chain smoking and sleepless nights. His face was lined with deep creases, his eyes shadowed with something heavier than exhaustion. As I slid into the booth across from him, he pulled a black and white photograph from his pocket and laid it on the table. It was a picture of Lillian Moore. Her empty eye sockets stared back at me. I studied the image for a long moment, then asked, "Crows?" Duval shook his head. No crows touched her, no gators either. Someone did this, and they left her like that on purpose. His voice was low even, but there was something behind it, something cautious. The town had rules, he told me, strange rules. But before I could press him further, the waitress arrived. She was thin, almost gaunt, with hollowed-out eyes that made her seem older than she was. Her hands trembled as she refilled our coffee cups. "You're here about the girl, aren't you?" she asked in a whisper. I nodded. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the old ceiling fan. "You should go back to Baton Rouge, detective," she murmured. "This town doesn't like outsiders asking questions." Then she was gone, slipping behind the counter like she had never spoken at all. The sugar-cane fields Duval drove me to the crime scene, a clearing near the edge of a sugarcane field. The road was little more than packed dirt, flanked by tall stalks of cane that swayed in the wind, rustling like whispered secrets. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy, thick, charged with something unseen. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, no hum of life. Just silence. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that waits. Duval handed me a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. His fingers lingered on it for just a second too long before letting go. I unfolded it and read. The rules of Belle Rive. If you find a door in the woods, don't open it. No one builds a door without walls. Never take anything from the water. Some things are meant to stay beneath the surface. If you hear your name whispered in the cane fields, don't answer. It isn't calling you. It's remembering you. On the first Sunday of every month, every house must leave an offering on the porch before midnight. It doesn't matter if you believe. It matters that it believes. There is a house at the end of Red Creek Road. No one lives there. No one ever has. If you see a candle in the window, don't look. If the door is open, don't step inside. If you wake in the night to the sound of something moving in your home, don't go looking. They've already seen you. The missing never come back. If you see them again, they are not them anymore. I looked up at Duval. Lily opened a door, didn't she? His face turned pale. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A town that keeps its secrets, Belle Reve, was the kind of place that swallowed things whole. Memories, people, truths. The sheriff knew more than he was saying. So did the waitress. So did everyone in this town. A door in the woods, a girl who broke the rules, a body left in the open, arranged deliberately, like a warning. I didn't believe in curses. I didn't believe in ghosts. But standing in that field, surrounded by nothing but rustling cane and the weight of something unseen, I realized that belief had nothing to do with it. Something in Belle Reve believed in itself, and it was watching. I returned to the scene alone. The sugarcane field stretched out in every direction, rustling in the evening wind. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, something I couldn't name. The spot where Lily had been found still carried the weight of something unfinished, something waiting. And then I saw it. Half buried in the ground, hidden beneath tangled roots and creeping moss, was a wooden door. It was old, far older than it had any right to be, and covered in strange carved symbols. Not random scratches, not weathered marks from time, but letters. A language, one I didn't recognize. The door had no handle, no hinges, no frame. It didn't belong here. I knelt, running my fingers over the carvings. The wood was cold, colder than the air around it. Something about it made my breath feel shallow, like I was standing at the edge of a deep well, staring into the dark. Lily had found this, and whatever had happened to her had started here. One's gas and grocery was the kind of store you only saw in small towns, a place that sold everything from bait to motor oil to expired candy bars. The neon open sign flickered in the window, buzzing faintly against the quiet. Lily had worked here. Inside, behind the counter, was Katie, a girl no older than 19 with dark circles under her eyes and a cigarette tucked behind her ear. She looked up when I stepped in, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, not curiosity, just recognition. She knew why I was here. I leaned against the counter. "You worked with Lily, right?" She nodded, saying nothing. "When was the last time you saw her?" "Night before she went missing," Katie said. Her voice was flat, automatic. She'd answered this question before. She left at the end of her shift, seemed distracted. "Did she say anything?" Katie hesitated. Her fingers drummed lightly against the register. She was asking questions. "About what?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, then away just as quickly. "The door," she said. A chill ran through me. "So she told you about it?" Katie exhaled, nodding. "She found it a few weeks ago. Asked around, but no one would talk about it. Not the sheriff, not her mom, not anyone. It freaked her out. And then?" Katie swallowed, her throat bobbing. She was on the edge of something she didn't want to say. "3 nights before she disappeared," she finally whispered. "She had a dream." I felt the air shift. "What kind of dream?" I asked carefully. Katie looked around, as if checking for listening ears, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "She dreamed that something came out of the door," she said. "And when she woke up..." A pause. "There was dirt in her bed," Katie murmured. "Under her fingernails. In her mouth." I stepped out of the store into the cooling night, Katie's words pressing against my ribs. Dirt in her bed. Under her nails. In her mouth. She had dreamed of something walking through that door, and then she had woken up with the earth still clinging to her. Had she sleepwalked back to it? Had she opened it without knowing? Or had something come through on its own? The sheriff's rules flickered through my mind. If you find a door in the woods, don't open it. No one builds a door without walls. Someone had built this one. Someone, or something. Lily had seen it. She had tried to understand it. And then, the town had swallowed her whole. I thought of her body, laid out so deliberately in the field, of the sheriff's pale face when I mentioned the rules, of the way the town itself seemed to hold its breath whenever someone got too close to the truth. Belle Reve didn't just keep secrets, it protected them, and it wasn't done yet. I went back to the field that night. This time, I was alone. The sheriff hadn't offered to come, and I hadn't asked. Some part of me knew he wouldn't have agreed anyway. The sugar cane swayed under the weight of a restless wind, whispering as I stepped carefully through the clearing. The earth felt softer beneath my boots, damp with the memory of something recent. The crime scene tape still fluttered, half torn, barely clinging to the wooden stakes driven into the ground. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not Lily's. They were larger, too deep. Something heavy had been standing here, not just passing through, but waiting. I crouched, brushing my fingers over the impressions. The shape was wrong. The arch too high, the length too long. It was almost human. Almost. My gaze drifted back to the door, still half buried in the soil. The carved symbols seemed deeper now, like the wood had swallowed more of them into its grain. As I reached out, my fingers barely grazing the rough surface, a sound. Not wind, not an animal. A shift in the cane. A slow, deliberate movement. I turned my head just enough to see the shape between the rows of swaying stalks. Tall, too tall, thin, impossibly so, its limbs stretched longer than they should be. Its head tilted at an angle that no human head could tilt, listening, watching. It didn't move toward me. It didn't run. It just stood there, waiting. I pulled my gun. Before I could raise it, 2 gunshots cracked through the night, splitting the silence. I whipped around toward the sound. Sheriff Duval. He stood at the edge of the field, his revolver smoking, his face pale under the glow of the moon. "Run, you idiot!" His voice cut through the fog in my head, breaking whatever frozen grip had locked my muscles in place. I bolted, the cane whipped against my arms as I ran, my boots digging into the soft ground, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Still standing there, watching, waiting, its long fingers resting on the door. I needed answers. The sheriff wouldn't give them to me. The people in town wouldn't either. But there was one man left. Father Etan Rousseau. I found him in the small, aging church at the edge of town. The wooden pews were warped with humidity, and the stained glass windows had lost their brilliance, their colors dulled by time and neglect. Rousseau was an old man, older than his years, his face worn with the weight of things he wouldn't say. He didn't seem surprised to see me. I told him about the door, the symbols, the thing in the field. He listened in silence, fingers laced together on the altar, his eyes heavy with something that wasn't quite fear, but close enough. When I finished, he sighed, leaning back as if I had confirmed something he had long suspected. "The door doesn't lead anywhere," he said finally. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. "What do you mean?" I asked. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "It's not a way in. It's a way to keep something down," he said. "But the land shifts. The earth moves." His eyes met mine. And what's buried doesn't always stay buried. That night I locked the door to my motel room. I latched the chain. I wedged a chair under the handle just to be sure. It didn't matter. At some point, I drifted into sleep. But when I woke, I knew something was wrong. There was an unmistakable taste in my mouth. Dirt. Thick and gritty against my tongue, clinging to the roof of my mouth, the back of my throat. I stumbled out of bed, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed to the bathroom. The sink water ran brown as I spit, coughing out soil that shouldn't have been there. Then I saw the door, the motel door. A handprint smeared against the wood, long dark fingers stretching downward as if whoever, whatever, had pressed against it had done so with force. And something else. A mark. A slow, deliberate drag from each fingertip, as if it had pushed harder this time, as if it had lingered, watching, waiting, testing. I left Belle Reve the next morning, but whatever had been watching me, whatever had touched that door, wasn't finished. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Belle Reve as I could. By nightfall, I was 2 towns over, checked into a roadside motel with buzzing neon lights and a receptionist who barely looked up as I signed in. This time, I didn't just lock the door. I salted the windowsills. I placed the Bible from the nightstand against the door. I left the lamp on. I didn't sleep. But at some point, exhaustion took over, and I woke up choking on dirt. I gagged, coughing, spitting onto the sheets. My hands shook as I reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling against the switch. The room swam into view. The door. Another handprint. But this time, it was closer. It wasn't finished with me yet. The motel room was silent, but I wasn't alone. I stood frozen in the dim light, my eyes locked onto the blackened handprint smeared across the door. My breath was heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the cold grip of fear tightening around my throat like an unseen hand. I wasn't in Belle Reve anymore. I had driven over 100 miles, left behind the sugarcane fields, the door that should never have existed, the town's silent, unspoken rules. I had left behind everything. But it had found me. I moved forward slowly, each step measured, deliberate. My fingers trembled as they brushed the dark stain on the wood. It was fresher than before. Darker. It had lingered this time. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry, tight, like something was lodged there. Panic rose in my chest, and I forced myself to breathe. I stepped back, turning toward the bathroom, my reflection barely visible in the mirror under the flickering fluorescent light. And then I felt it, a grit between my teeth, a bitter, familiar taste. Dirt. I spat onto the tiled floor, tiny grains of earth mixed with saliva, my hands clenched into fists. I can't stay here. I turned, grabbed my bag, shoved the door open without looking back. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp pavement, and something older, something heavy pressing against my skin. The parking lot was empty. A neon vacancy sign buzzed somewhere in the distance, casting faint red light across cracked asphalt. But I felt it, a presence, watching, waiting. There were no footsteps, no shifting shadows, just a sensation deep in my gut, something primal, something wrong. I moved quickly, climbed into the car, slammed the door shut. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. I fumbled for the keys, forcing them into the ignition, and then, in the rear-view mirror, a figure. Not fully formed, not clear, a shape just at the edge of the parking lot beneath the glow of a street lamp. Tall, too tall, arms hanging too long at its sides, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were listening. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. And then, it moved. Not toward me, not like a person would. It slid backward, a slow, deliberate retreat into the shadows, melting into the tree line beyond the lot. It never turned, never ran, just faded, dissolving into the dark like it had never been there at all. But it had. It wasn't chasing me. It wanted me to know it was there. And it was waiting. I slammed my foot on the gas. I drove without a destination, without a plan. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere I could run. It had followed me. It had found me. No matter how many miles I put between myself and Belle Reve, it clung to me like a nightmare made real. I kept thinking about what Father Russo had said. If you've seen it, if it's touched you, you can't escape it. The only thing you can do is figure out what it wants. There was no way out. Only answers. So I turned the car around. It was just past 2 a.m. when I pulled into town. Belle Reve was silent, swallowed in darkness, its streets empty save for the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The cracked asphalt and crumbling facades of the buildings felt even more lifeless than before. The town had always seemed forgotten. Tonight, it felt abandoned. The sheriff's station stood at the end of the main street, a squat, aging structure with peeling paint and a single light burning in the window. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. Sheriff Duval was behind his desk, a cup of coffee, long gone cold, resting in his hands. His eyes were heavy, ringed with exhaustion, but he didn't look surprised to see me, like he'd been expecting this, like he'd been expecting me. I sat down across from him, my hands gripping the edge of my jacket to keep them from shaking. "It won't let me go," I said. My voice was quieter than I meant it to be. Duval sighed, setting his cup down carefully, as if gathering his words. Then he looked up. "I know." I swallowed hard. The weight of everything pressed down on me. The dirt in my mouth, the handprints on the door, the thing in the parking lot watching me, waiting, always waiting. I need to know the truth. Duval rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling like a man about to open a door he had kept locked for too long. "The thing you call a door," he said, "isn't a door at all." I frowned. "Then what is it?" He hesitated. "A seal." The room felt colder. "What do you mean, a seal?" Duval leaned back in his chair, studying me. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "It was never meant to be opened," he said. "It wasn't built to let something in or out. It was built to hold something down." My mouth went dry. I thought about the symbols carved into the wood, the way the door had no hinges, no frame, no purpose, except to be there. "What's under it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duval didn't answer right away. But when he did, it wasn't with words. He just looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before, not fear, not even resignation, but acceptance. Like he'd known all along that this moment would come, that I would come back, that there was never any other way this could end. Whatever was buried beneath Belle Reve, whatever Lily Moore had disturbed, whatever had found me, wasn't done yet, and it was waiting. Sheriff Duval told me about Belle Reve's history, the parts no one talked about, the forgotten deaths, the missing people who were never found, the things buried not just in the ground, but in the town's silence. Over 100 years ago, before it was Belle Reve, before there were streets and buildings and a sheriff's office, there was a settlement, a small camp of settlers, isolated in the Louisiana swamps. But they weren't just any settlers. They weren't farmers. They weren't missionaries. They were something else. They didn't believe in God, Duval said, his voice low and careful. Didn't believe in the devil either, but they worshipped something. I leaned in. "What?" He exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup. "Something older than time, something that sleeps beneath the earth." His words settled over me like a layer of dust, ancient and suffocating. "What did they call it?" I asked. Duval hesitated, just for a second. Then softly he said, "The Remembered One." The words made my skin crawl. "The Remembered One?" I repeated. Duval nodded. "It doesn't kill you, not right away," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "It just, remembers you." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "What does that mean?" I asked. Duval's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "It marks you, follows you. You might not see it all the time, but it's there. And if you remember it long enough..." He stopped. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "If I remember it long enough, then what?" The sheriff looked at me for a long moment. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Then you become a part of it." I felt it then, the weight of something pressing against me, something I couldn't see, couldn't touch, but knew was there. The remembered one. I had seen it. It had touched me, and now it was waiting. Duval rubbed his face, his exhaustion bleeding into every movement. "That door was never meant to be found," he said. "It's not a passage. It's not an entrance. It's a seal." I nodded, already knowing what he would say next. "But something disturbed it," I murmured. Duval nodded grimly. "Lily Moore disturbed it. And now it's awake." I thought about the dreams, the dirt in my mouth, the thing standing outside my motel door, pressing its fingers against the wood, each time closer than before. It didn't need to chase me. It was already with me, already inside me. And the longer I thought about it, the more I felt it pressing against the edges of my mind, like something trying to crawl its way in, like something pulling me deeper into its memory. I had come back to Belle Reve for answers, but now I wasn't sure I wanted them, because the more I knew, the more I remembered. And the more I remembered, the less of me I had left. A terrible stillness settled in my chest, deep and suffocating. I could feel it. Not just the weight of Duval's words, not just the chill creeping through my bones, but something else, something wrong. I remembered the blackened handprints, each time closer. I remembered the dirt in my mouth, the way it clung to my tongue like it had crawled there on its own. I remembered what Father Russo had said: "The missing never come back. And if you see them again, it's not them anymore." And then, Abby. Her body, carefully placed, arms crossed over her chest. Like an offering. Something clicked in my mind. A realization so sharp and cold that it made my stomach turn. I shot to my feet. "I need to get out of here." Duval didn't move. He just sat there staring at me with tired eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and could never unsee it. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "It's too late, detective." I shook my head. "Number, I can still leave. I just need to..." I grabbed my keys, turned toward the door. I didn't care where I went. I didn't care how far. I just needed to go. I pushed open the door, and then I saw them. The parking lot was empty, silent. The air smelled of damp asphalt, of old rain and something sour underneath. But my eyes were drawn downward, to the wet ground just outside the door. Footsteps. My footsteps. The pattern of my boots, pressed into the mud, leading from my car to the sheriff's office. The exact path I had taken minutes ago. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. There were more, right beside mine, larger, deeper, heavier. They had followed me. My pulse hammered in my skull. My breath came fast, shallow. I felt the weight of Duval standing behind me, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard. The marks weren't just next to mine. They matched my stride, step for step, like something had walked with me, like something had been there the whole time. I took a slow step back, retreating into the sheriff's office, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it. "It's too late," Duval repeated. His voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was just true. I turned to face him. "Tell me how to stop this." Duval didn't answer right away. He looked at me, really looked at me, then let out a long breath. "You can't stop it," he said. "That's not how this works." I felt something crack inside me, something raw and desperate. There has to be a way. The remembered one doesn't take you all at once. His voice was steady, but his hands were curled into fists. It follows, it waits, it lets you feel it, and if you remember it long enough. I swallowed. His words from earlier echoed in my head. Then you become a part of it. I shook my head. No, I whispered. I won't let it take me. Duval's eyes were sad. It already has. The room was too quiet. The silence was too full. I could feel it, just beyond the walls, just beyond sight. Watching, waiting. I had never left Belle Reve, not really, and I never would. I stood frozen on the threshold, my breath caught in my throat. The footprints stared back at me, deep and undeniable in the wet earth. One set, mine, small, hesitant, following the exact path I had taken to this door. And beside them, step for step, something else, larger, heavier, wrong. It had followed me. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering in my ears. Duval hadn't moved. He stood there, watching me with the weary resignation of a man who had already accepted something terrible. "You can't run," he said, his voice quiet even. I shook my head. "There has to be a way." Duval sighed, pushing back from his desk. He took slow steps toward me, the dim overhead light casting shadows across his face. "There's only one way," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You have to go back." A chill ran through me. I didn't need to ask where. I already knew. The door in the woods. I had thought it was a seal, something meant to keep whatever was beneath it locked away. But that wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't just a barrier. It was an invitation. The drive back to the cane fields was silent. Duval sat in the passenger seat, his revolver resting in his lap. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask him to. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the open window. The road narrowed as we neared the forest's edge. The tall stalks of sugarcane thinned into towering cypress trees, their roots twisting like skeletal fingers in the shallow water. The air smelled of damp earth, of rot, of something old. My hands tightened on the wheel. I had left this place. I had tried to escape it, but it had never really let me go. I killed the engine. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Duval spoke. "We don't have much time." His voice was firm, but underneath it, I could hear something else. Not fear. Not quite. Something worse. Recognition. Like he had been here before. Like he had done this before. I stepped out of the car, the ground soft beneath my boots. The cicadas had gone silent. The usual hum of Louisiana's swamps, frogs, crickets, the rustle of unseen creatures, was gone. The silence felt thick, pressing against my skin, waiting, watching. The trees loomed ahead, and beyond them, buried in the earth, was the door, the invitation, and whatever was waiting on the other side. The door was right where I had left it, half buried, marked with symbols I couldn't understand, and now open, not fully, not enough to see what was underneath. But the earth around it had shifted, the wood had splintered, something had moved. I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Duval stayed behind. "This is where I stop," he said. I turned. "You're not coming?" He shook his head. "I've already made my peace." A bitter laugh escaped me. "That's not comforting." I wasn't trying to be. I swallowed hard, then turned back to the door. I could feel something rising from beneath it, not physically, but inside me, like a memory, half-formed, pressing against the edges of my mind. I reached for the wood, my fingers brushed the carvings, and then a whisper. Not from Duval, not from the trees, from beneath. My own name, spoken softly, like something, had been waiting for me. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. If I answered, I knew what would happen. I had heard the rules. If you hear your name whispered in the cane fields, don't answer. It's not calling you. It's remembering you. I exhaled slowly. Then, I pushed, and the door opened. The road back to the woods was swallowed in darkness. I drove in silence, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly, my breath shallow and uneven. Sheriff Duval sat beside me, his shotgun resting across his lap. He hadn't spoken since we left Belle Reve. Neither had I. There was nothing left to say. The sky above was an endless black void, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. The sugarcane fields swayed on either side of us, their brittle stalks moving like skeletal fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Then, through the windshield, the trees loomed ahead, and the door was waiting. I killed the engine, and the headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the old wooden door in the ground. It was different this time. The last time I had been here, it had been half buried, covered in dust and age. It had been sealed. Now it was open, just slightly. I swallowed hard, my pulse a steady drumbeat against my ribs. I climbed out of the car, my flashlight beam cutting across the clearing, landing on the carvings etched into the wood. I knelt, running my fingers over them. No dust, no moss, no sign that it had ever been buried at all. It was ready. I felt Duval's presence behind me before he spoke. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff didn't answer right away. When he did, his words felt like a sentence being passed down. "You have to go through." I turned sharply, rising to my feet. "What?" Duval tightened his grip on his shotgun, his eyes locked on the door like it was something alive. "It's already chosen you, detective," he said. "You don't have a choice anymore." A chill ran down my spine. "No," I whispered. "There has to be another way." Duval shook his head. "There isn't." I took a step back, my breath coming fast. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying something beneath it. A whisper, faint, familiar. I knew that voice. It was mine. I felt my stomach twist. I had spent so much time running, so much time convincing myself that if I just got far enough away, if I just didn't acknowledge it, it would disappear. But I had been wrong. It had never been chasing me. It had been pulling me back. I looked down at my hands. A fine layer of dirt clung to my fingertips. I hadn't touched the ground. I hadn't moved. It was inside me now, waiting. Duval took a slow step forward. His face was grim, but there was no anger, no fear, just acceptance. "If you don't go through," he said, "it won't stop." I knew what he meant. The handprints on the doors, the footsteps in the mud, the thing that had followed me from one motel to another, closer each time. It would keep following, keep remembering me, until there was nothing left of me to remember. I inhaled sharply, and then, before I could change my mind, I pushed the door open. The world fell away. The night, the trees, the sheriff, the town, gone. For a moment, there was nothing. Not blackness, not emptiness, just absence, and then breath. Not mine. Something exhaled in the dark, and I knew, without seeing, without hearing, it had been waiting for me. I stepped forward, and the door closed behind me. There was no light, no gust of cold air rushing out from the other side, no sense of space, no distant horizon, just darkness, thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like a second layer of flesh. It wasn't the kind of dark you find in a room with the lights off. This was something deeper, something that existed before light ever did. It had weight. A dense fog slithered out from beyond the threshold, creeping along the ground like unseen fingers curling around my boots. It moved with purpose, I turned my head slightly, glancing at Duval. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His shotgun was still clutched tightly in his hands, but there was no point in raising it. No point in shooting at something like this. Because this wasn't a thing you could fight. This was something that had always been here. Waiting. And now, it had me. I turned back toward the door. Hesitated. Breathed in the damp, heavy air one last time. Then, I stepped through. And the world disappeared. There was no sensation of falling, no shift in pressure. One moment, I was in the woods outside Belle Reve. The next, I was somewhere else. But there was no landscape, no sky, no ground beneath my feet, at least not in the way the earth had ever felt before. It was solid, yet somehow wrong, like standing on the memory of a place rather than the place itself. The darkness wasn't empty, it was alive, moving, shifting. I could hear it breathing. Or maybe that was me. I reached forward, though I didn't know why. My fingers met nothing. No air, no wind, no texture at all. Just the overwhelming sense that something was watching me. Not from in front of me, not from behind, from everywhere. The remembered one. It had been waiting. For how long, I didn't know. Time didn't exist here. Nothing did, except for it. And now, me. I felt it before I heard it. A slow shift in the darkness. Then, a whisper, curling around me like a thread being pulled through the fabric of my mind. Software patient. Familiar. It wasn't speaking a language I understood. But somehow, I knew what it was saying. I remember you. The words slithered into my skull, deeper than sound, deeper than thought. I remember you. A hand brushed my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the dark, waiting, expectant, wanting. A realization settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't about where I had gone. This was about what I had become. Duval had told me the truth. The remembered one didn't take you all at once. It waited. It let you feel it, let you fear it, let you remember it, and the longer you did, the more you became a part of it. I tried to move. I couldn't. Not because something held me down, but because I belonged here now. The whisper came again. I remember you. And this time, I whispered back. I don't know how long I was there. A second, a minute, a lifetime. Time had no shape in this place. It didn't flow forward, didn't pull backward. It simply existed, stretching and contracting like something alive. I was floating, standing, falling. There was no gravity, no sky, no ground, no sound, except for the faint, rhythmic pulse of something vast and ancient pressing against me. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I felt it surrounding me, an endless, unfathomable presence, too large to comprehend, too old to have a name. It wasn't looking at me. It had no need to. It had already seen me. It had already remembered me. And now there was no turning back. Then, a whisper, not from ahead of me, not from behind, not from above or below, from inside me. A voice that wasn't mine, curling through my thoughts like roots through soil, sinking into the cracks of my mind. You remember me now. I gasped, or maybe I screamed, but there was no air here, no lungs, no sound. The darkness around me shuddered, shifting like something vast and unseen had turned its attention fully toward me. The whisper came again. You remember me now. And with those words, something inside me split open. Memories that weren't mine flooded my mind, centuries of waiting, of watching, of following those who had unknowingly whispered its name in the deepest corners of their fears. I saw them all. The first settlers who had built Belle Reve around it, hoping to bury what couldn't be buried. The ones who had vanished, the ones who had remembered too much, the ones who had become part of it. And then I saw Lily Moore. I saw her standing at the edge of that wooden door, her hands shaking, the dirt already clinging to her skin. I saw her open it. I saw what came next. I tried to move. I couldn't. I tried to forget. I couldn't. It had wrapped itself around me, through me, not chasing, not hunting, just holding me here. Because now, I was a part of it. Now, I belonged. I felt my mind breaking, stretching, twisting into something new. And then, the world shattered, and I fell. I woke up lying on damp earth, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was cool beneath me, the scent of wet leaves and rich soil thick in the air. My fingers curled instinctively, clawing at the dirt as if trying to anchor myself to something real. Above me, the sky was a pale gray, muted sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees. The world felt different, not wrong, not broken, but less. Like something had been taken, or something had been left behind. I had returned, but I wasn't the same. I forced myself to sit up, my limbs heavy, my head throbbing with something deeper than pain. The door was gone. There was no sign of where it had been, no disturbed earth, no lingering symbols. Only the flattened grass where I had fallen, as if it had never been there at all, as if I had never stepped through. But I had. I knew I had, because I could still hear it. The whisper, faint, lingering, coiled inside my skull like something waiting to wake up. I turned my head. Duval was standing a few feet away, his shotgun lowered, his expression unreadable. But his eyes told me everything. He had seen this before. He had seen others come back, and he knew. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. I couldn't answer, because the whisper in my mind hadn't stopped. It hadn't left. "You remember me now?" I dug my fingers into the dirt, trying to ground myself, trying to push the words away. But they weren't just words anymore. They were a part of me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, it would always remember me. I left Belle Reve that morning without a word. I didn't stop to say goodbye. I didn't look back. I just got in my car and drove, putting as many miles between myself and that cursed town as I could. The road stretched ahead in a long, endless blur, the sugarcane fields giving way to empty highways and nameless towns. No one stopped me. No one even looked at me. But I knew. I knew I wasn't leaving alone. Hours passed. The sun rose, then fell. The world outside my windshield became nothing more than an endless stream of gas stations and neon-lit diners, truck stops and hollowed-out motels. By nightfall, I was over 100 miles away. Far enough. It should have been far enough. I pulled into a roadside motel, the kind that smelled like stale cigarettes and bleach, the kind where no one asked questions. I locked the door behind me. I wedged a chair under the handle. I lay down on the stiff mattress, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. Maybe, just maybe, I could sleep. I woke at 3 a.m. Something was wrong. I sat up, my mouth dry, my tongue thick with something bitter. I ran a hand over my lips and felt it. Dirt. My stomach lurched. I stumbled out of bed into the bathroom, spitting into the sink. Dark grains of earth swirled down the drain, clinging to my teeth, my gums. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. I had left. I had gotten away. Hadn't I? My breath was unsteady as I turned back toward the door, and then I saw it, the handprint, dark, smudged, pressed into the wood. But this time it wasn't faint. It wasn't half-formed. This time it was complete. 5 long fingers, perfectly defined. It wasn't just touching the door anymore. It wasn't just reaching. It had found me. And in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. I hadn't escaped Belle Reve. I had brought it with me. Some things can't be outrun. Some things don't let go. I don't know how much time I have left before it takes me completely. But if you're reading this, if you've followed this far, then you've already made the same mistake I did. You've remembered it. And now, it remembers you. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, if you felt the same creeping dread that I did, then don't stop here. Subscribe to my channel for more terrifying mysteries, chilling encounters, and the kind of stories that stay with you long after the lights go out. Hit that subscribe button, because sometimes the only way to fight the darkness is to remember.